Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is going to be an introduction to structured expressions using Cameo Systems Modeler, also known as MagicDraw, soon to be known as CATIA Magic. What is a structured expression to begin with? It is the way we do queries inside of our model. It is what we can use to build the MetaChains, is what we can use to add scripts that will pull out certain bits of information to show how certain things are related to other things in our model. And a lot of that happens inside of different tables within Cameo. That could be inside of a generic table. That could also be done in a relation map. That could be done inside of a matrix. But for today's example, what I'd like to do is show a very simple system and then how we can query different things that are related to other parts of the system in different ways. And as you see here, we have a system block, we have an operator. This is an association connecting the operator to a use case. This is a containment relationship that shows that the initialized system use case has an activity contained within that. That's also what that's indicating with the rake symbol. Then notice we have a value property called total mass and a requirement with a satisfy relationship. So what we can do is pull in certain bits of this information, and I'll do that by going to a generic table. So if we open up a diagram, a new diagram, we'll go to create diagram and then generic table. What we'll start out with is the question of what do we want to be the base of this query. And MetaChains or even simple navigation queries will always have a base element. So that's what this table is asking you for, is the element type. And when we assign that, what that means is for this specific table, everything that you query will start with that element. That's essentially the starting point of all of your queries. And then you could take that as many steps as you need to, but it will have to begin with this element. So in this case, let's say we wanted to figure out what are all of the requirements that are connected to our system via that satisfy relationship. So if we start with the system, we could either use the block that's the system block, or we could use the requirements. Either way, but the MetaChain will be slightly different because looking back to this, the satisfy relationship is a subtype of a dependency and it has a target. So depending on which way we're going with this query will depend on whether or not we're talking about the supplier dependency or the client dependency. So let's look into that a little bit. Let's say we wanted to start with the requirement. We'll drag in a requirement, and that sets the base element of our MetaChain or simple navigation to the requirement. And then we'll scope this. So this could be scoped to the entire model. It could be scoped down to a selected package in your model. It could also be scoped to blocks or other types of namespaces. So things that can contain other things could be a scope. So we have our max mass. Notice we're only currently looking at the name of that. So one query that you may want to do would be to actually see the text that would be the actual requirement for this requirement element. So what you can do is go to your columns, and Cameo gives you a lot of out-of-the-box queries. So because this is set to a requirement, it'll give you the option to show verify method, trace to, refine by, all of these options here, and then we can customize some as well. So let's say we wanted to see the text. That will be the actual requirement itself. But then let's say we wanted to see, satisfied by. It's satisfied by the total mass. So these are some simple queries that they have built in. But I don't see anything that would give us the actual system that is satisfying it. So one thing to note before we get into the structured expressions is that because we are only trying to see the system, that's essentially one hop away. And what Cameo has are these things that they call simple navigations, which are anything that is related to something else by only one hop. And essentially we're going from the requirement to the satisfy relationship to the system. So that would be something where you could actually do a simple navigation. So getting back to this, I want to touch on one thing quickly before we create this query, and that's the difference here between these two options when you go to create a custom query. Notice you have new custom column and then you have new derived property. The difference between these is if you were to create this query as a new custom column, what you'll do is you'll have that query available only in this table. However, if you create that as a derived property, it will actually show up as a derived property in your model, and you will be able to see that in other parts of your model. And what that means is, going back to that base element, if I were to create a new derived property that's based off of a requirement, anytime I go into a specification for a requirement, you'll now have that available as a field in this specification window for that requirement or for requirements in general. Now that field won't be in the specification window for blocks because it's not based off of a block unless that's what you had as the base element. So that can be really useful, but it's also good to note that when you're doing new derived properties or creating those, you want to make sure that whatever you name your query is exactly what it produces, because sometimes you'll end up with queries that pull in other things that you didn't intend for them to pull in, and that can be really confusing to someone if you named it something where you're thinking it's going to query something else, but it's pulling in all this other data or all these other elements. So just keep in mind that can cause confusion if you're not careful, and you want to make sure that you really hone in on your query. That way what it produces is exactly what it says it should be producing. But derived properties are also great because you can easily incorporate velocity scripts with those and essentially base it off of an element, and then you can call out the name of your derived property and easily pull in that data into documents and things. So that's another advantage of using derived properties. But for this case, let's say we just want to create a new custom column. So getting into this, notice it says expression. So this is really where we get into what Cameo calls a structured expression. And in this case, we'll only have to do a simple navigation. And if you look at this closely, you'll see that there is two blocks. There's one here and it's connected to one other one. That is really all it means to be a simple navigation. And then if you note on the MetaChain, a MetaChain is showing you that there is something that is more than one hop away. And that is really when you will need to do a MetaChain, is when you're trying to get to something starting at a base element, but it's connected in a more distant way. That way you have to actually take a few hops in order to produce that result. So notice when you get to this, it's asking you what you want to name this, and that is what will become the name of your column at the top. And then you have a type here that's unspecified. I recommend leaving that unspecified, but we'll come back to that because it'll automatically choose a type for you based on what it thinks the type should be. However, if you're not seeing that, it might be because you're not in expert mode and it'll automatically select the unspecified anyway, which is also fine. But let's say we want to see the satisfying system for our requirements. So that we've named the column, and now what we can do is simply look for the relationship type that we know will connect that. So let's say satisfy, and we have that satisfy relationship here. And then it also asks you, would you like to see source to target or target to source if you hit this drop down, or both? So depending on which way this relationship is going, I believe what we're looking for is target to source. So let's say OK, and that is connecting directly to that total mass. So that's the same thing as the satisfied by in this case. And notice it produced this value property and not the actual system. So let's say we wanted to see what the system was of this value property that's satisfying this relationship. Now we're getting into a MetaChain because that is not one hop away. Even though it looks like it's connected to this block, this satisfy is actually directly connected to the value property, which is why you're seeing that result in your structured expression. So what we can do is figure out, well, how is this value property related to the system? And to do that, we can go to the specification for the value property. So we look at the value property, and the first thing we want to do is take a note of the type of element we're looking at, and that is a value property in this case. And then notice it says the owner is the system. So what we're going to do now is take a note of that, but we actually need to start at the requirement, then go to the satisfied, then go to the value property, and then go to the system. So we'll actually go into the specification for the requirement. We'll see what that satisfy relationship is called in the context of this requirement, and then we'll follow that trail. So one thing I recommend doing whenever you're doing MetaChains is to open a notepad and actually write this down. It's a lot easier to do that than to try to remember this. So let's start at the requirement. We know that the requirement will be the base element, so we'll say that that is the requirement. And then I'll put a slash because it wants to know the property of what this satisfy relationship is called. So we go into the specification window, and what we're looking for is the satisfy relationship. So if you notice, we have a satisfy relationship here, and to the requirement, it's actually in the role of what is called a supplier dependency. And that's because it's at the arrowhead of this satisfy relationship. So we're actually not going to write down requirement to the satisfy relationship. We're actually going to write down requirement to the supplier dependency, which is the satisfy relationship. So your next step in this MetaChain would be to write down supplier dependency. And then we follow this trail and see where it leads us. So what I'm going to do now is open up the specification for the satisfy relationship by clicking on that, saying open specification. And then we're actually going to write down satisfy because that is the next link in this MetaChain. So the supplier dependency is the satisfy. And then we have to figure out, well, how do we get to the value property? So once we're in the satisfy relationship specification, we know we're looking for a value property. So notice the related element pulls in both of these, so that probably isn't the best path to take because we want to narrow this down to where we're only looking at a value property. So I would recommend in this case going to the client. So we could write down satisfy and then client. That's the next step. And then let's follow that. So we go to the value property now, which is what we were at a minute ago. And now we're going to write down value property. And then because we're trying to get to that system block, we know that that system is the value property's owner. So it is also the namespace of the value property. It's also the redefinition context. So any one of those things, or the class or the classifier, would produce a result of this system block as related to that requirement. So either of those options would work for you. In this case, I'd probably just go with the owner. So we can write down value property and then owner, and that will be our MetaChain. So we have that figured out, and now we have to go enter that into the structured expression window, and then we should produce the system block as related to the requirement. So I'll close this out. We go back to the model, and we can edit this by right-clicking and saying we'd like to edit this custom column. And now notice this is no longer saying unspecified, it's saying element. So what I would do in this case is actually go back and unspecify it. That way it'll choose what it believes you should have for an element type. Otherwise, if it's set to something else, you may not realize it will actually negate your MetaChain if you end up narrowing it down to an element that does not match the type that you had in the previous query. So we're going to go to MetaChain in this case, and you use the insert option here, and it gave us requirement already because that's the base element type of our MetaChain. So looking at our notes, we go to requirement and then supplier dependency. So the property of that, we'll look for supplier dependency. Select that, and then we insert again to do the next step down. Notice it gave us the option for dependency because that's what it thinks, or that's what it's recommending would be the next step because we've selected supplier dependency, but we actually want to narrow it down to a specific type of dependency, which in this case is a satisfy relationship. So we'll change this to a satisfy relationship by searching for that. And then we say we want to go to the client. So we'll search for client. And if you see the pattern here, it's recommending named element. However, we want to go a little bit more specific than a named element. So pretty much everything is a named element. In this case, we wanted to use a value property and then the owner. So we'll narrow that down to value property and then owner. And there it is. So notice you also have this option for single value. And if you check that, it'll only produce one element as a result. If you leave that open, it's essentially the same thing as setting the query result to having an upper bound multiplicity of unlimited, which means it's not going to only display one result. It'll display however many are in that array that it creates for you. So we'll leave this as satisfying system. We'll say that's fine as not having it checked as a single value. We'll say okay. And this should produce the result of our system. Now notice, in this case, we're actually producing something else here. We're seeing total mass, and that's not what we wanted. So what we can go look at again is, why would it have produced this as well as that? And I believe it's because if we look at this simple navigation, we still have the satisfy relationship checked. So it's actually doing two queries at the same time, and we probably don't want that, so we can get rid of that and say okay. And now it's only producing the system. So now you could move these around and say that the requirement has a satisfying system, and it's this system. And that is really an introduction to structured expressions and also simple navigation and MetaChain navigation. There are other types of queries you can do, such as find and implied relations. And quickly, I'd like to touch on some of the other ones that are built into Cameo. And if you go to the create operation portion of this, what you'll see is there's the option to do a MetaChain, which is the same as this. There's the find, which is the same as that. Then you have filter, applied relation, type test, property test, union, exclude. These are actually really neat to do. And then you have some of the other ones that are built into Cameo. And I want to look at those briefly because there's a plethora of these that you can use, and it's good to understand how to use those. So if we go to operation from model, and then we look at the list here, what you'll see is all of these operations, which are essentially opaque actions or opaque behaviors that are built into Cameo, can be used as part of your queries. So we have all match, and, any match, concatenation, contains, equals, exclude. Some of these that become really fun to play around with are greater than or equals, if then else. If then else can be really, really useful because you can build upon those. You can embed other operations inside of those operations. Is empty is good to see if there's something that is not there. And you have max operations. That's neat to use if you're trying to find the highest value in an array, or minimum, not equals, or. So a lot of these are fun to play around with. Unions can be really neat as well. And that's this similar thing. It should be the exact same thing as this. However, I'd recommend using the union here. But an example of what a union operation would be, let's delve into that quickly just to show you how you can use some of these. Would be, let's say you had two different columns such as satisfied by and satisfying system, and you actually wanted to display both of those in the same column. Well, that's what we had a minute ago, so obviously you saw we could just add the simple navigation, but let's say we wanted to just merge these two MetaChains essentially into one column. That way you saw both of those results in the same column. You can do that by using a union operation. So what you would do in order to make that work would be either go to a new derived property, a new custom column, and then you go to create operation and you go to a union. Now notice when you do that, it says create operation under this union. What you'll do is add a MetaChain as the operation type, and then we'll end up adding another operation that's another MetaChain, and it'll do a union of both of those MetaChains. So let's start by redoing the MetaChain that we had a moment ago. You can copy and paste things in the structured expression window, so that's another thing to keep in mind. If you go to edit, you can copy some of these or copy the entire thing. We'll just recreate this. So we'll go back to the requirement and we'll go to the supplier dependency. And then we'll do the satisfy relationship. And then looking back at the notes, we had client and then value property and owner. All right, so that's one thing that we will be merging with the other column, but we need to go create the other one, right? So we could simply do a simple navigation as well, or we can add another MetaChain to this. You could also add another operation if you'd like. So going back to this, let's say requirement, and then we'll do satisfied by, which is already built into Cameo, right? And then when we say OK, we should see our new column with both of those things merged together, and that's essentially what a union operation is. Now, notice that you had the exclude operation. That can be very useful as well. If you don't want to see things that are being produced, you could tell it to exclude that result as well. So a lot of really neat things that you can do within the structured expression window. If you guys have any questions on these, please feel free to reach out. There's a lot of neat things you can do with this. There's a lot of interesting queries, and sometimes they get a little bit tricky. So I'd be happy to go into a little more detail on specifics on certain aspects of this if you'd like. Please let me know if there's any certain types of operations you'd be interested in doing. Some of those that get interesting are when you're using things that you'd like to produce values with, such as the greater than or equals, because you would think that you can simply add a MetaChain to that and it will produce results, but a lot of times it gets a little bit more tricky when you were saying, if you were to say greater than, for instance, now it's saying A and B, so then the question is, well, what is it looking for, right? And I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, A would be greater than what, right? So you'd think you could just type in or do a MetaChain in this case, but what you should do would actually be to use a real number or an integer. So if, let's say you wanted to say it's greater than 5, you'd have to go first to this A equals null, change that to a real number. Now it's saying dot dot. And you type in your number. Now it's A is equal to 5. But then what is greater than 5 is what it's actually asking you here. So for this, as I mentioned, you'd think you could just go to a MetaChain and say, I want this result to be, if it's greater than 5, to produce the result. However, what you need to do first is actually use a first operation and then do your MetaChain embedded in a first operation. And a first operation goes into some computer science terms that I won't delve into too much of this at this time, but essentially, if you'd like to produce results with this, you need to use a first operation first. So you'd go to B equals null, operation from model, and then look for first operation. select that. And now that you're inside of a first operation, you'd actually do your MetaChain underneath of that. So whatever the MetaChain would be to get to that value that you're evaluating would be the MetaChain you'd put in here. You'd say okay, and then that would be how you can actually utilize that greater than operation. Same thing for the greater than or equals, less than, same thing for the minimum and maximum operations as well. I'll stop there for now, and if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Let me know. Thanks for watching.